It's an honor to be here, and I'm going to share some of the stuff I've been doing recently. This is a collaboration, as you can see, with Kevin Bermond, that is now postdoc in Zhaojing Lab at NYU. And I'm going to talk about, well, as you can see again, about Glassy phase in dynamically balanced networks. So this is the outline of my talk. So I will start by shortly summarizing some experimental observation about slow relaxation dynamics in cortical circuits. I will explain why this is kind of interesting problem to think about from a theoretical point of view, and how essentially thinking theoretically about this problem leads essentially inevitably almost to try to understand what happens in balanced networks with more structured connectivity. In particular, I will be discussing balanced networks with partially symmetric connectivity, and I will present a mean field theory that allows one to capture at least part of the possible behaviors that you can observe in these networks. And then I will present, well, as I already hinted, this theory doesn't allow to actually to capture all possible behaviors. So I will be discussing some numerical simulation we have been doing in the part of the parameter space where we cannot really analytically understand what's going on. And I will argue that these results provide pretty strong evidence for the existence of new phase. This doesn't exist in random balanced networks, and this phase is very similar to, actually it's strongly analogous to what happens in some models. So you have some glassy dynamics and some of these. Then how compelling it is evident is for you to judge at the end. And finally, as usual, I will conclude with putting these results into the context of previous studies that have looked at this. We point out some limitations of what we have done, and eventually I will discuss some, I think, interesting perspectives that these results open in the well in the context of experimental studies. Okay, so intrinsic timescales. So intrinsic timescales is essentially a kind of a dignified word for autocorrelation time of the spike count. So essentially, what you do, you have your recordings, you count the spikes in these bins, and then you build an autocorrelogram. This is what is shown here. And then you can just look at how much correlation you have depending on the time lag. And so what you see here is that essentially you have autocorrelation times that, at least in this case, they span at least 1 second. A slightly more sophisticated way of doing this is to pool all of these together. So you build kind of a pseudo population, average autocorrelogram, and then eventually this is much smoother because of the averaging, and then eventually you can fit this decay with an exponential decay plus an offset. And this is what has been done in this study, and these are essentially the results. I would like to point out that this offset is in fact also a measure of time, because this is the amount of correlation that has not decayed within your observation time windows. So again, here, this has been done in this time period is essentially about 1 second. So that means again that you have significant correlation that has not decayed by 1 second. Okay, so even more. So all of this essentially points to the fact that if you kind of estimate your microscopic time scales to be something within, let's say, tens of milliseconds or hundreds of milliseconds, this means that to be conservative, these time scales are at least one order of magnitude longer than the microscopic time scales. Okay. So why this is a problem? Well, this in general is not a problem. The problem in this context arises from the fact that in the same kind of recordings, if you look at the cross correlation now between the spike counts, these are generically small. Okay, so that means that at least in a first approximation, you could say that these degrees of freedom, so the activity of the neuron, are essentially uncorrelated. And then, and then you should expect that decay is on a microscopic time scale. So this should be tens of seconds, hundreds of milliseconds, not seconds and more. Okay. Before going into the question of slow decay, let's have a little detour about correlations and talk about the balanced state. So how do you get weak correlation in a network which is potentially very strongly interconnected? Well, this is the theory of the balanced state. This theory was introduced by Van Reswijkers and Polinsky in 1996 in the context of sparse networks, essentially to account for the irregular activity that was observed at the time. And it was a more recent observation that among the many consequences of the balanced state, I don't have time now to go into these details, is that one of the consequences of the balanced state is that even in densely connected network, as a result of the dynamics, essentially you will have a cancellation of the correlations. And so correlation will be generically weak in a balanced state. I could not resist to show a small part of my collection about this very iconic figure, which is essentially the Mona Lisa of balanced networks. You can see a few examples. So if you have any special version, please send it to me. And this is about the balanced state. So, but operating in the balanced state would generically result, at least for random networks, but in weak correlation. At the same time, operating in the balanced state would not generically result in slow correlation times. Okay, so how how you solve the problem? There are several suggestions. One is, well, given that this is not a generic property of the balance, that means that your network is tuned to some non-generic point. And this is the idea of edge of stability. So in fact, you are not in a generic point in your parameter space. You are very close to the point where, the fixed point will lose the stability. So basically, the bulk of the spectrum, so that controls the linear response of the system, is very close to where you're losing stability. So you will have very slow time scales, at least in linear response. And this is if you are on the stable side. Another possibility is that you are in the unstable side. So you're coming to the bifurcation this way. So that means that the autocorrelation time is diverging. And so if you are close enough, at least in a mean field model, then you can, in principle, tune your autocorrelation time to whatever value you want, because you're going very slow to essentially to infinite. Now, this is interesting, but there are some aspects of the theory that are not completely satisfactory. One, the most obvious one, is obviously that this requires some amount of fine-tuning. That's not clear in a finite size system how this could be achieved, or which amount of, in fact, time scales you could really get out of this. And also all this theory is valid, or at least we understand this theory in random networks. And we will see that actually cortical networks are not exactly random. Different, I'm just looking how I'm doing with time. A different idea is, in fact, that, well, in your network, now this network cannot be random anymore, but in your network you have multiple stable states. And as a result of the noise, in fact, you explore different stable states. And so the long time scales that you observe are, in fact, essentially related to the typical lifetime of these metastable states. So this is a different idea, but at least in the way it has been implemented so far, it also suffers from finite size effect. So, sorry, it also suffers from kind of fine tuning. So you have to be kind of careful in the way you adjust the number of neurons that are in these clusters, and it's not entirely clear how you should scale the system. And so also these, even if the idea is very interesting, it's not clear, it's not completely satisfactory. Okay. So as I said, as I briefly hinted in the case of the random network, actually there are some aspects of the cortical connectivity that are relevant to this question. So one is kind of the amount of disorder, in the sense that the probability, you have, variability in the number of connections that you receive, you have variability in kind of the synaptic efficacies that you see, and these are kind of broad distributions. And so this poses the question, for instance, to which extent you can really tune, in this specific example, the size of the cluster, or the amount of connectivity, the average connectivity within the cluster, so on and so forth. And also, again, there is this question that the random connectivity is not exactly consistent with experimental observation. And in particular, what has been now reported a lot of times is that, in fact, there exists a certain reciprocity in the connection, in the sense that if a neuron makes a connection, neuron A makes a connection to neuron B, then the probability that this neuron connects back is larger than the marginal probability. Okay, this you can see here. Okay. So all of this to say that if we want, so weak correlation suggests, cross correlation suggests that well, one way to think of this is that this is something taking place in a balanced network, so in network operating in a balanced state. And then eventually this idea of the multi-stability suggests that we should, at very least, look at some structured connectivity. And so eventually we are, in a sense, almost necessarily led to consider what happens in in a balanced network when you include some of these structure in the connectivity. So this is the model network I will be discussing. So obviously there is some amount of simplifications, because the problem is it's complicated. So we will be studying a whole-to-all connected inhibitory network. The network is operating in a balanced regime. Synaptic efficacies are sign constrained, so they are, in this specific case, they will be all negative, so the effect of these will be inhibitory. And we allow for pairwise correlation. activity of neurons is non-negative, and we use a simple rate model, so in which these are the equation of the model we study. And in this model, the activity of a neuron is just a function of instantaneous function of the input the neuron receiving, and these are just the equations. So the new parameter that we have is this rho W that just measures the amount of correlation in pair connections. Okay, and for the numerical simulations and the theory I will be discussing in detail, we use these are to some extent these are immaterials details. So, but there's some practical importance. So we'll be using log normally distributed synaptic weights, and because theory becomes very simple from a technical point of view, we will use as a fi equal, we will use a threshold linear function. Okay, so one of the main difficulty in developing mean field theory in this specific case is that because of these correlations in the synaptic efficacies, essentially the distribution of the input is not Gaussian anymore, and these obviously introduce some complexity into the problem. One way to deal with this complexity is to use a method which is very well known in physics, which is called the cavity method. Okay, this method that was originally invented in the context of spin glass and was devised in order to make quenched averages without using the replica method. Now, actually, it turns out that this is interesting because while in order to use the replica method, you need to have an energy function, the cavity method you can use also in contexts where you don't have the energy function. And that's what we did here. So let me just walk you through the steps. They are very simple. So we consider just a fixed point. And then in a fixed point, we can write the input to neuron I in this way, where essentially the tilde variables are, so this nu tilde j would be the activity of neuron j in a network where there is no neuron I, okay? And then there is a part that depends on the adjustment that, well, the adjustment produced in the activity of the network due to the presence of neuron I, okay? So far, this is exact. We just divided the activity, okay? Now, what's the effect of the presence of neuron I? Well, this is just a small additional input to neuron J. And this additional input will be something of order 1 over square root of n. So this is something small, at least in the limit in which we are, which is n going to infinite. And then, well, you can expect that you could compute this delta nu j by linear response theory. And in fact, that's what you can do. And you will get something like this, where this key jk, this is just the static susceptibility matrix. And this is the tiny change in the field due to the presence of neuron I. Okay. I just want to note before proceeding is that because your perturbation is order 1 over square root of n, then you expect your delta nu j to be 1 over square root of n. So that essentially means that this term can be, or you should expect this term to be order 1. Okay, the wij are not 0 on average. And so this is something you cannot throw away. But you can compute this way, okay? Now you can plug everything, sorry, you can plug everything back and you get something like this. So you have this part, which in analogy with the cavity method in physics, we call the cavity input. And you can show that this field is in fact the Gaussian. And you can easily compute mean and variance because the wij and the nu tilde j are uncorrelated. Okay, this is by construction because nu tilde j is the activity in the network when there is no neuron I. Okay, so by construction they are uncorrelated. You can compute mean and variance, and then you get the reaction term, which is you are in linear response. So this will be proportional to nu I, the activity of neuron I, and you have this term. This term you can compute, in fact. And it turns out that this term is just what you see here. So it will be proportional to the level of symmetry, to the variance of the synaptic efficacies, and this key, which is just the average static susceptibility. Okay? And plus some stuff, which is 1 over square root of n, you can throw away. And now you just impose self-consistency. And so you can solve either in the field, sorry, I guess I will say field from time to time, this time in the input. So imposing self-consistency, you get this is just an implicit expression that gives you hi, so the input as a function of the cavity input, or you can solve it in the rate, and this will give you the rate as a function of the cavity input, this fiat, which is just a composition of these two functions. Okay. You may wonder if this mapping is in fact, well, so again, this is a mapping because the fact that we choose neuron I is immaterial. So this is true for any neuron. So this in fact is a mapping between the cavity input and the actual input. And you may wonder if this is in fact is well defined. It turns out that if the fixed point is stable, then this mapping is one to one without jumps. Okay, so this is perfectly well defined in the thermodynamic. In general, this is complicated to solve, but it turns out that for the threshold linear, you can explicitly obtain this mapping, and moreover, you can do the Gaussian integrals that are involved in the theory, because now by using this function, you can impose self-consistency and find well, the fixed point. This amounts to find self-consistently the mean and the variance of the cavity input, and the value of the average static susceptibility. You can write self-consistency equation. This is standard. You can write self-consistency equation. You solve it, and blah blah blah. Again, as I said, for a threshold linear, you can do this analytically. And so now we'll show you how the theory works. So this is an example. So prediction of the theory is that, in fact, the Gaussian input, sorry, the cavity input will be Gaussian no matter the level of symmetry. And the actual input is a nonlinear function generically of this cavity. This is an example where you see different levels of symmetry. And you see the distribution of the cavity input. This is the bars. And the theory, this is the black line. So as you can see, this is Gaussian, pretty well captured by the theory, and regardless of the level of symmetry. Here you can see this mapping I was talking about. So you can see cavity input versus the input in the full network. Again, the squares are the simulation, and the black line is the theory. Again, this is captured very well. And then obviously you can, using information about the cavity input and the mapping, you can compute the actual input. This again is down here. Black lines is the theory. The rest is the simulation. And these tiny red stuff that you see, if you can see, this would be the prediction of the mean field theory. It obviously predicts always the same Gaussian field. And you can see that apart in the case where there is no symmetry, so in a random network, the prediction of mean field theory is pretty broad. This is just a slightly more systematic test of the theory against numerical simulation. It's always the same. The lines are the theory, and the dots are the simulations. So you can see that this kind of works uniformly well in the range of levels of symmetry, which is not very interesting. What's more interesting is that you can see that mean field solution is strongly dependent on the level of symmetry. And so you might wonder what's the effect of these real kind of actual terms. So one way to look at this is to look what happens to the distribution of activity in the network as a function of the level of symmetry. This is shown here, and you can see the fraction of active neurons. So remember, this is threshold linear, so there will be a fraction of neurons that will be silent, okay? So here it's plot the fraction of active neurons as a function of the level of symmetry. And you can see that this decreases by increasing the level of symmetry. And as a result, the neurons that are active, you are in a balanced regime, so you have to adjust the activity of the other one so that, uh, well, you keep the balance. So as a result, the distribution of activity will change. And in particular, you see that at increasing level of symmetry, the distribution of firing rates becomes more skewed. Okay, so there are different ways to understand this, in particular why the fraction of active neurons decrease at increasing the level of symmetry. One, I think, useful way also for the rest of the talk is, uh, and this can be done because this is threshold linear. So in a threshold linear, basically, in a fixed point, the Jacobian of the Jacobian is simply the connectivity matrix restricted to the neurons that are active. Okay, so now you can use basically random matrix theory to see what's the spectrum of this Jacobian, and you can do this. And so what you get is that basically the real part of this is the bulk, of course. Then you have the large one, but you don't care. This is the bulk of the eigenvalue. This would be basically the real part of the eigenvalue will be in this range, essentially with probability 1 when you send them to infinity. The 1 comes from the yeah. And so you can see that, in fact, increasing rho w, in fact, increasing sigma w for that matter, actually has destabilizing effects. And one way that you can counteract this destabilizing effect is, in fact, by reducing the fraction of active neurons. Okay, this is dynamics. So in using this, basically, you can compute the bound on how many neurons can be possibly active for any given value. And this is the red line. So as you can see, this, well, the simulation and the theory is always below the red line. And interestingly, for reasons I will elaborate later, on the critical line, the bound is saturated. Okay? Okay, so the critical line, so what about stability? Uh, in fact, you can essentially use the same kind of arguments to check the stability of the fixed point. So essentially, in my derivation, in the derivation I showed, the main assumption is that you can compute this correction by linear response theory that assumes then that the state is stable, and then that means that this delta nu j will be quantities of order 1 over square root of a. Now you can kind of check self-consistently if this is the case, and you can compute, in fact, the mean and the variance of this delta nu j, and you get the following. So, well, you will get delta nu, in fact, on average, the average of delta nu is 1 over n. This is interesting. I don't have time to go into this now, but this is also a consequence of the balance. So the adjustment will cancel on average. And then the variance of this fluctuation is given by this formula, which is not important. This will be proportional to nu e square. What is important is that this term here, in fact, can diverge. And it will diverge when, well, when this goes to 0, and then gives you this condition. So the domain field theory is, well, the solution of the domain field theory is stable as long as this inequality is satisfied. And again, we can check this with the numerical simulation. This is shown here. So we plot the average response multiplied by n as a function of the activity of the neuron that you put in the network. And you can see that, so the symbols are different network size, and the colors, well, colors will be different level of symmetry. And you can see that, in fact, again, the theory predicts this kind of a finite size effect. The theory predicts very well this relationship, and you can see again that this lies essentially in a parabola, and regardless of the network size, this is pretty good. Okay, and so the the instability basically is signaled by the divergence of this term. And this is an example where, in fact, uh, the instability will occur at fully symmetric network. So it, again, you can see the theory and the numerical simulation. Of course, when you go close to the bifurcation, finite size effect will be more important. And then you can see in the inset how, in fact, this nonlinear response basically explodes as you go close to the bifurcation. Okay, so we have a way to compute also the stability of the fixed point. And again, because this is threshold linear, in fact, you can compute the critical line, you can compute it analytically, and you get this. And then you get this bifurcation diagram. Okay, so this is the region where the fixed point is stable, and here we have analytic control. This region is unfeasible, means that you cannot actually have a network that sits here, and this is because the weights are sign constrained, so depending on the variance, you cannot achieve arbitrarily negative correlations, okay? And then there is an unstable region, and we don't know what's happening in the unstable region. Actually, to be more precise, we know what's happening on this line, and here, this is a random network, so we know that here we go from a stable fixed point to a chaotic regime. And there is a fully symmetric network, so we know that the dynamics is relaxational, so that means that there is an energy function, a Lyapunov function, so there can be no chaos. And when you cross here, in fact, there will be mutability among essentially a very large exponential number of fixed points. So the question is, what happens in between? What happens in between depends, in a sense, depends on what happens here. Okay, there are different scenarios. We know that can be different scenarios. So, for instance, in okay, let's not go. So, the question is what happens in between. Okay, and well, a cheap way to know what happens in between is to run numerical simulation. So that's what we did. And so what we do here is we generate a random connectivity matrix, and we run 100 random initial conditions, and then we see what happens. And we do this for 5 different realizations of the synaptic matrix for different levels that are shown. This rescale synaptic gain just means that the synaptic gain is measured relative to the critical value. Okay? So when this is negative, you are in the stable. When this is positive, you are in the unstable mean field. So you can see that when you are in the stable part, you always find one solution. When you are in the unstable mean field part, you start finding different solutions. Okay? So what is plotted here is the averaged over the 5 realization, the average number of different solutions that we find. Okay? And well, if you can see, there are the tiny dot that gives you an idea of the variability. This is not very important. The main point is that numerical simulation shows that the number of solutions that you find increase with the level of symmetry and with the synaptic gain. Okay? And you can study some of the properties of the solution. So, for instance, you can ask how variable is, I don't know, the average input in the solution, how variable is the variance of the average input. And, well, it turns out this is basically this point here. And from this is the cumulative distribution of the relative variation across solution. And you can see that this, in fact, is very sharply peaked. Which means essentially that all the solutions are statistically equivalent. Okay, so we know that they have to have the same firing rate because, well, that's because of the balance, but it turns out that also the marginal statistics are the same. This is not shown here, but also the number of active neurons in this solution is essentially very sharply peaked around the same value. And then you can ask, well, how different are the solutions? One way to do this is to measure the overlap. So basically the correlation between 2 different solutions. And then you get, this is, again, the same point here. And then you will get something like this. This is not too much information you can gain from it. So what you can see is that these solutions are not independent. They tend to be positively correlated. Now, what happens in the limit of large n, in the sense, does this distribution shrinks to a single value of the overlap, or there is a continuous distribution within a range? This I would say it's impossible to say from here. Another more interesting thing that you can do with this is go back to this random matrix argument that I made and try to plot the fraction of active neurons in this solution. As I said, this is very sharply peaked. So essentially, there is no variability from solution to solution. And you can plot it as a rescale synaptic gain. And this black line that you see is the marginal stability bound that I talked about before, okay? So you can see that they all lie above. So in principle, they could not be there in an infinite system at least. But you can also see that, well, the finite size effects are pretty strong. So one thing that you can do, that's what we did, is for the parameters for which we have at least 4 simulations, basically we extrapolated to n infinite. And when you do this, you will get these black dots. And as you can see, these black dots, they lie very, very close to this marginal stability line, okay? So this suggests, in fact, that all these solutions are, well, they are marginally stable. To kind of further understand this point, what we did is that we, for each of these solutions, we numerically computed the spectrum of eigenvalues, and we compute the spectral gap. Okay, so this is the minimal distance. This is the closest eigenvalue to the imaginary line where you lose the stability. Okay, and we can plot this as a function of the network size. So this is always the same. This is an example. You can see that in fact the spectral gap goes down. This is in the unstable, so positive synaptic gain. You do something like this. This is in this regime, and you can see that this nicely converges to something far from the stability line. And this, for reference, this is the blue dots is the fully symmetric case that we kind of understand because we know what should happen there. Now there is some argument that has been done in the context of spin glass, which essentially says, at least if the synaptic matrix is fully symmetric, is that this spectral gap should go to 0 as 1 over n to the 2/3. Okay. So the black line that you see is in fact this fit. Is basically we plotted this dependence where the prefactor has just been estimated by by least square fitting. But you see that it's let's say the agreement is very suggestive. And the inset is just an example to show the variability of the spectral gap that you get. So again, we compute this numerically so you can see how they look like. So this is, well, when you are in the stable mean field, so the bulk, again, you have a very large eigenvalue, but this doesn't matter because it's on the right side. So this is a stable fixed point. So you see it kind of far from the instability line, and this is instead with positive synaptic gain, and you see that basically you are very, very close to the stability line. Again, this for reference because here we have a clearer understanding of what's going on. This is for the fully symmetric case, and again, you can see the same property. Probably at this point, I should stress that this point that I'm showing you is not very close to bifurcation line. In fact, this point is here. So in fact, this properties is everywhere in this region. So in this sense, you don't have to be close to the bifurcation line to this. All these region we have argument to say that this is true as soon as you have positive symmetry. This is true in all these regions. Okay, so in this sense here there is no fine tuning. Okay, I'm already out of time, right? Okay, sorry. Okay, so now you can ask, in fact, is any of these relevant to again, these are marginal, essentially all these fixed points are marginal. So if the system is large enough, essentially there is no no way you will get into one of these points. So the dynamics will be dominated by the transient. So you can ask, is this relevant given that the dynamics is dominated by the transient? Is any relevant to tell me that you have all these fixed points, so on and so forth? In fact, this depends. Now we know, because we know from, for instance, spin glass physics, that in fact when you have a kind of landscape or fixed point like this, in fact you have some, this also affects the transient, and probably one of the most kind of spectacular effect of this is this breaking of ergodicity. So that means that essentially the system takes so long to, to go to equilibrium that in fact, well, it's permanently out of equilibrium. So we wanted to check if, in fact, these properties are present in this model. And so we measured, well, we have this measure of breaking of ergodicity. So essentially, you initialize your dynamics with some initial condition, and then you compute the average of the age along the trajectories. Okay, and you do this for different initial conditions, and if the system is ergodic, then eventually the difference between these two estimates, so the difference in the two estimates starting from two different initial conditions, should eventually go to zero. This is the definition of ergodicity. And so we measure essentially this parameter. This is the average distance of along different trajectories of the point in space. Okay. And again, first thing you check where you know what's going to happen. So for instance, on this line, we know that you go from a single fixed point to a chaotic regime. So the dynamic is ergodic on both sides of the transition. And in fact, this is what you get by using this measure. No matter where you start, eventually this measure will go to zero. Okay? Sounds reassuring. Now you can do also on the multi-stability line. Here you know what's going to happen. And as expected, if you are on the left of the bifurcation, you go to zero, and if you are on the right of the critical line, you go to some non-zero value. This is because you end up in different fixed points. Now the question is, what happens here in between? And so we ran some simulation on this point. Why we looked at this point? Because this is, if you take cortical data, this would be more or less the value of rho W that you would get from cortical data. So let's say between 0.2 and 0.5. Well, if you do that here, you see that if you are where the stable fixed point, well, where the fixed point is stable, well, you will go to zero. There is only one solution, so no matter where you start, you will end up there. But if you start it here, well, you see that it's not clear if this is going to zero or not, but what's clear is that this is 2000 times 2000 microscopic timescales. So this is very slow decay, and the dashed line that you see is stretched exponential feet that again show that this is in fact very, very slow decay. So there is, for a very long time, there is memory of the initial conditions in the network. So I guess I'm done here. I have time to, David, I have time to this, or I will take the questions.
No, you can go to continue with yeah.
Okay, so well, so essentially the results that I've showed, I think they are pretty suggestive that, in fact, at least in this network with this specific transaction function, we observe something which is very, very similar to what people call glassy phase or glassy dynamics or whatever. So we have a very large number of fixed points. They are all marginally stable. And in fact, in this region, again, this is a region, this is not a point, this is a region. And in this region, you have very long memory of the initial condition. So that means that essentially you have very slow decay. In fact, this decay is not even exponential. Other people have looked at these, obviously, before us, at these questions. Here are just some of the studies that I will briefly discuss, but then I'm happy to answer the question, discuss. And this selection just reflects my ignorance, not any statement about the field. So this is so I've divided these in single population and excitatory inhibitory networks. Single population is more easily comparable with what I've shown. So this is a classic, I would say, study by Chrysanthis and Polisky, where in fact they show that essentially in Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model, as soon as you have a little bit of asymmetry, essentially the glassy phase completely disappears. Now, this is obviously true for the Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model, but it's not true for any. I mean, this is not generically true. For instance, there are mean field spin glass model like the p spin with p larger than 2, where this is not the case. And the reason this is the case in the SK is because in the SK all the equilibria are essentially marginal. So all the states are the same, have the same energy. So, and they are all marginal. So as soon as you introduce a little bit of structural perturbation, essentially they all go away. Okay. But now, if in fact you have a distribution of of states with different energies, and then when this is symmetric, this will be dominated by the marginal one. But now, when you introduce structural perturbation, so the marginal one will be gone, but you will be left with the other one. Okay, and this seems this would seem what happens in this specific case, and what happens for sure in the p-spin spherical model with p larger than 2. This is a more recent paper where they essentially studied the rate version of the SK model, and they didn't report anything like what I'm reporting, and there can be different reasons to explain this discrepancy. One is that the rate version essentially behaves like the Glauber one. So all these fixed points, in fact, they will be all marginally stable. And then as soon as you introduce a little bit of asymmetry, they will be gone. And then it behaves exactly like the SK model. In fact, that's probably the most likely possibility. Another possibility is that they use the different measure of breaking of ergodicity. They looked at the correlation, and now it's I discovered, in fact, it is well known that the correlation is not in fact very good measure. This is already reported in this original paper by Chrysanthis and Polisky, where they observe in fact that even if the system is not ergodic, the autocorrelation decays to 0. So this would suggest that another possibility, maybe let's say less likely than the first one, is that in fact the correlation is not the right thing to look. So they didn't look. They looked at correlation, so probably it wasn't there. This is the only paper, in fact, that I know where they've studied partially symmetric network in a context of EI networks. Again, the focus of the study was somehow different, but also they don't report, please correct me if I'm wrong, they also don't report this kind of state. They report obviously that the decay times slow down as a function of the correlation, but also they looked at, now the question is different, but also they looked at the autocorrelation. So in a sense, it would make sense also to try to do this. And then I think I can in fact stop here. I don't want to take too much time. At least I can discuss. It's not really okay. Thank you.